Uh, my name is Roger Sijie, and I'm Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at National Taiwan University. Yeah, before we start, let me introduce the Dean of Institute for Advanced Studies in Humanity and Social Science, National Taiwan University, Professor Liao Xianhao, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Luo. I'd like to, of course, first thank the Department of History for co-sponsoring this talk with us. And also thanks to Professor Luo for agreeing to chair this lecture. And of course, thank you very much, Herr Dr. Klaus Mühlhahn, for agreeing to sharing your most recent insights into contemporary China with us. Let me just, give you a very, very short introduction to our institute. The full name of the institute is Institute for Advanced Studies in the I can never say it at once. Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences, which is a platform organized by the university for facilitating interdisciplinary research and exchanges. As a rule, we're devoted to all kinds of possibilities of cross-pollination from different disciplines. Yeah. So for this purpose, we organize various kinds of activities, one of which is the current event, which is called the Leading Edge Lecture Series. For this particular series, we always invite internationally renowned, top-notch scholars to share with us their most current research. And I'm sure, President Mühlhahn's talk will substantiate this point. Thank you very much. Back to you, Professor Luo.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Liao. Yeah. Before we start, let me, it's quite an honor, to be able to be here to moderate this talk. And it's quite also an honor to introduce Professor Klaus Mühlhahn, to the audience. Professor Mühlhahn received his PhD from Free University of Berlin in 1998. And his PhD dissertation is actually about China, about Shandong, and about Jiaozhou, actually. And it's quite interesting to know from 2002 and 2004, he was a visiting fellow at UC Berkeley, which is one of the best places, any modern Chinese historian want to state. And then in 2004, he went to he took a position in Finland to be also a kind of dream job for every Chinese historian, professor of contemporary Chinese and Asian history. It is very, to me, it's quite challenging to think the possibility of having this position to teach. And in 2007, Professor Mühlhahn moved to Indiana University in Burlington. And from 2007 to 2020, he pretty much he taught at Indiana University. Yeah. And in 2020, Professor Mühlhahn moved back to Berlin, to take another position in the Free University of Berlin. In terms of Professor Mühlhahn's book, he produced two very important books so far. The first book titled Criminal Justice in China. To me, it's very interesting because the book is also the winner of 2009 Fairbanks Prize. To me, it's quite a big prize. And I remember I read part of the book, and I remember how Professor Mühlhahn emphasized the importance of institution, in our understanding of modern Chinese history. And by using the institutional approach to modern Chinese history, then we could have a comprehensive understanding of modern Chinese history rather than just some probably political correct oriented explanation about modern China. And today Professor Mühlhahn will talk about his latest book, titled "Making China Modern: From the Great Qing to Xi Jinping." And this book and his last book, Criminal Justice in China, they were all published by one of the most important publisher around the world, Harvard University Press. And after do some research about Professor Mühlhahn's book, officially second book, I have to say, because I'm a big fan of Yan Lianke, who is one of the most influential writer about modern China. And Yan Lianke's work, officially about post-1949 China, actually enlightened a lot of people's understanding, officially about the dark side of China. And it's kind of a bit surprising, but also a bit exciting to learn that Professor Mühlhahn used Yan Lianke's word to start his book about making China modern. And I would strongly recommend everybody to listen carefully what Professor Mühlhahn will tell to us, because according to the book, I can see he already offers some very different approaches. Probably we can call this approach as a so-called European approach to China, not so-called American approach to China. Let's offer our warm welcome to Professor Mühlhahn's talk. Professor, please.
First of all, thank you so much, the both of you, for this very warm welcome and this very generous introduction. I feel truly honored to be asked to give this lecture, and I was very much looking forward to the opportunity to reconnect or connect with colleagues in Taiwan. You didn't mention that, and you could know, of course, that a long time ago, in 1988 to 1991, I actually studied in Taiwan as a student at Taiwan Shifan Daxue. And I have been back to Taiwan, but not that often. And it's now been, I think, a couple of years since my last trip. And I actually really was hoping, to have a chance to visit Taiwan, but the circumstances are what they are. And I think a format like this really allows us to be at least intellectually in contact and in dialogue, even if not in person. So again, I really thank you for the opportunity. And now I'm going to give you an overview of some of my thoughts that led me to write this book. The process took a long time, I must say. I'm not a very prolific publisher, so that makes only 2 books in English. I've written other books in German, though, but in English only these 2. But I mostly are very slow because I was, I need to think and read. And I wanted, but with this book, I also wanted to take the time. It's a book that has, like any book, has some things, flaws in it or mistakes that I would like to correct that escaped my attention, but I wanted to keep that small. The amount of mistakes I wanted to have small. So I will try to share my screen. I hope that works. And you see the PowerPoint. If you can just let me know if this is working. Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay, good. All right. So let's then get started here. So I wanted to, this is an overview of about what I'm going to say. I will first talk a little bit about the goals and the approach of this book, which I think distinguishes it from other books here. And then I wanted to go through some of the key insights. And I immediately see that there's a typo here in the Qing dynasty. Of course, we'll correct that later. So I would like to start with a quote from Walter Benjamin. And so I was really extremely happy that in your generous introduction, you pointed out that that book is sort of a European take on Chinese history, because when I wrote it, actually, that was very deliberate for me, a deliberate choice, you know, a deliberate effort to try to see if we in Europe have a different perspective on China that is distinguished from the American perspective. And, you know, in my biography at that time, it was also fitting because I just moved to Berlin when I started working on this book in 2010. And then it took me again 9 years, you know, to write the book. But it was very much influenced from moving back to Europe, from being in Europe, also in one of the main capitals, obviously, in Europe, and trying to understand sort of, you know, how the world looks like from different perspectives. And I know that I was in conversations with my good friend, Professor Ayer from Berkeley, and she's always maintained, you know, that the world looks different from different parts. And I think that sort of intrigued me. And I tried to push or explore how this different perspective can look like. And that's why I also start my talk here with this quote from Walter Benjamin, who lived in Berlin, as you know, of course, in the 1920s, a deep intellectual thinker. And he was convinced, you know, that as I quote here, in every one era, one must try to extract history from the conformism that is about to overwhelm it. And, you know, and that means, of course, that there's an imperative here. It's from the piece on the concept of history. There's an imperative here that seeks to challenge ideas of history. That there's, of course, we know that there's history, that it's homogeneous or monochrome. But to think as the past of something that is basically always unfinished. It's always open. And so not only during different time do we have a different understanding of history, different generations have a different perspective of history, but also, again, as I said, also from different places in Europe, in the United States, in Africa, and elsewhere, and in China, of course. The history that we write has to be, in fact, you know, has to be different. And sometimes our discipline is not very appreciative of this, let's call it this diversity, or the pluralism of approaches and viewpoints that we need in history. But it also means what Benjamin says is that no present can claim ownership of what has been or what is to come. So history can and must always be updated, renewed, rewritten all the time. And we should always try to free ourselves of the conventions and restrictions of earlier generations. Because as the world is moving forward, we have to have different perspectives on the past. And I think that is especially true for China, that keeps on changing and developing and you know, also reinterpreting itself in ways that are often unexpected and therefore also in need of explanation. So to make that short, I think my effort here was really to free myself from the restrictions, to get rid of conventional narratives. So I don't know if I fully succeeded, but I wanted to sort of break free of these existing narratives and take a new, fresh look on Chinese history. And that had also something to do with my frustration with part of the historical discipline. And since I'm talking here to colleagues and friends in Taiwan, I would like to be perhaps a little provoking when I criticize the scholarship. And of course, in my, you know, to also steer up a discussion, of course, I know that things are more complicated and one has to tell, you know, there are nuances and so on. But overwhelmingly, I was frustrated and still actually am. And perhaps even in the last 2 or 3 years, I have ever been more frustrated, because our image of China and Chinese history is so unacceptably simplified. And the discussions that you see in the United States, or now, unfortunately, also increasingly in Europe, built on these very simplistic understandings. And again, you know, there's a lot of academic work out there that's more nuanced and more differentiated. But, you know, in the public realm, still these very simplistic images prevail. And I think, let me give you two examples. You know, they either emphasized, and some of these simplistic notions emphasize that there is an anachronistic, you know, that the Chinese culture is sort of has an anachronistic hold on China and has a fundamental development on China. So many things here are explained that we see in China today are explained by the prevalence or the impact of cultural traditions, as if China would always be acting under some sort of secret spell derived from its cultural tradition. That does not mean that I deny for a second the importance of culture, but the idea that especially in China, people live out and cannot be free from some of their cultural traditions, why others in the United States are so creatively, you know, dealing with their own traditions. It just seems to me very, very mistaken. So cultural factors are often said to play such a big role. The other very simplistic notion is ideology in politics, especially ideology. So this is to say that there is this misshapen ideology that plays this big role because China is under this heavy weight of its communist tradition. It's a newer tradition, but it's still said to say that that sort of influences China. So China is always seen as somehow lagging behind, you know, somehow not up in our present, erroneously following either false ideological or false cultural orientations, constantly searching for something that remains elusive and unattainable. So China is always seen as to be beholden to stifling strands of thought that held it back. And I think, as I said, you know, I simplify here, right? And but especially in the public realm, it's there. And some of the more academic work is also absolutely proliferating these notions. But for me, it was always clear China is a much more complicated place. And I think as we see high-speed trains crisscrossing the country, by the way, which are now much more often on time than German railways, and we once prided ourselves of being a very punctual country, but the German railways are always late. And as technological leadership in areas such as artificial intelligence has been attained or will be soon reached, whereas technological feats such as space, you know, travel, the historic landing of an unmanned spacecraft on the back of the moon, I think that should give us pause and prompt us to reconsider these simplifications. And I think these assumptions prove more and more to be obsolete. So I think rather than trying to explain that China is held back by its ideology or by its cultural tradition, I think what we need to understand is the surprising and unexpected, in fact, one could even say the impossible, economic and technological success of a development in breakneck speed that I think is in many ways unprecedented in human history. We don't see many cases like that. Also, its repercussions and implications are immense. Never has a society been so fundamentally transformed in such a short time. It's a breathtaking experiment of a huge scale that the world that has not seen before. And the drivers of this change are, I think, less ideology or culture, but economic growth, social change, globalization, and technological progress. And that has, of course, completely changed China, but in ways that I think are difficult to understand. also, we should also say that hardly anybody in Europe or the United States has thought that such a development was possible. It contradicted, I think, almost all the theories and assumptions of social and economic theories. And I think that is actually really, really interesting, as I'm now, often in touch with economic departments. It's amazing to me that they never sort of, what one couldn't say never, but they rarely, question their theories in the light of what had happened in China. So I think it is exactly the theoretical impossibility and unexpectedness, but also the peculiarities and immense consequences of the Chinese development, which call for historical explanation. Because I think here's wonderful chance for history, to try to understand something that many systematic disciplines cannot explain very well. China's development is also in need, of course, of explanation because it's one of the most momentous developments in our time. China, not only has China changed profoundly, but of course, global conditions have also shifted significantly, and the effects are felt everywhere. China has just become such a large presence on the global stage. So many of the dramatic political and social changes, even here in Europe or in the United States, have something to do with the developments in China. So for instance, the loss of industrial jobs and the resulting political and social upheavals that we see in the United States and Europe, the stagnant wages among the middle classes, the increased competition on world markets, the higher costs as we just can live through right these days. If you just look at energy prices, the higher costs for raw materials, for food, for energy, all have something to do with the entry of China into the global landscape. China's policies and investments are driving digital transformation, the development of artificial intelligence, globalization, climate change, including China's own substantial contribution to global warming. So we can even say, as been of course mentioned recently, often also by the Biden administration, that there are global challenges that cannot be solved without China. That's for sure. And that's also a result of this development that I'm talking about. This also must be mentioned that China's development has offered really golden opportunities to European and American firms and enterprises in the last couple of decades. That's often overlooked, right? We often see as China's emergence has only negative effects, but people easily ignore that it has created a golden age for German and American and European businesses who have derived huge profits from their China businesses. China's huge lucrative market has contributed significantly to global economic growth and increased wealth in many parts of the world. The profits of almost all major global companies would be much smaller, and also the profits paid out to shareholders without the sales in China. So now where does this leave this, me here? So thinking about all this through, I thought what we need is a deeply revisionist effort against the leading general texts in circulation. So again, please be reminded when I talk about existing scholarships, what I have in mind are these big histories that represent China history to a larger public, not the more specialized monographs, academic monographs that of course offer a much more nuanced picture. But what I found frustrating is that it's these big texts that are still in circulation, have been written about 30 years ago. They have a profound influence on how the political class thinks about China. And I'm often in touch now with German foreign policy people, and you wouldn't believe how much their view of China is influenced by these older texts that had a profound influence not only on the field, but perhaps that's a bigger thing here, on the public perception of China. So I wanted to write something that, is revisionist against these leading texts. I wanted to produce a book that does not treat China's contemporary transformation, these enormous changes that I've discussed, as an afterthought or simply as a postscript, but rather I put them in the center of the book. So my book is to understand or reveal the past behind the present. My interest was in the present, offering an historical explanation of the changes that we see in China today, the changes, the contradictions, the tensions of this very diverse country. The book accepts, therefore, the fact that China is a major and powerful player in the world. It has always been a major and powerful player, based on its own achievements and successes in tackling some of the major problems that the country has faced historically, and we will go into them in a couple of minutes. So unlike an earlier generation of scholarship, I move away from conventions of binary framing, such as, the United States and China. I wanted also to place Chinese history at the center of an interconnected and truly global network of engagement that includes the entire globe, not simply the West. And so I could have done more, in retrospect. But at least I try at occasions to highlight the links that China had over its course of its modern history, not simply to the US and Europe, but also to India, even to Turkey, to Southeast Asia, and including even Africa. And again, I think what would really be needed is a book that highlights these global linkages more, but I tried my best to at least argue that if we just look at China and the West, that is so limited, and it also has just a very limited explanation. It's also, I wouldn't want to deny that the West is important. And of course, what my book always tries to do is to highlight the significance of Eastern Europe. No other country had a bigger influence on China, and I think that still holds true, as the Soviet Union and so the connections to Eastern Europe and of course Central Asia, also of profound significance for China. So I had tried to offer a new narrative of Chinese history and sought to approach China on its own terms, highlighting both achievements, but also, of course, setbacks and unresolved issues. So as we said, again, I wanted to reveal the past behind the present, so very much in Benjamin's sense. And I said already that this was a major motivation to understand present-day China. And I think it requires a deep historical approach. Again, as I said in the beginning, this is a great opportunity for history, to make sense of this. It's a wonderful chance. Of course, you have to write such a large-scale history. Also, I think history plays a major role in China's evolution, as it explains the developments that China has taken that I think are very difficult to compare with other parts of the world. While China was linked to it, it has taken a path that is very distinct, I think, which also often limits what we can do in terms of historical comparison. Second, this new history should not only describe, document, narrate, but to explain, as you see here, the second bullet on this PowerPoint. Of course, some of you will say, well, I mean, isn't all history, about explaining things? Yes, of course, in a way that's true. But I think especially when we look at how the history discipline in the United States has developed, I think there are many works now that are content with the mere description or documentation of developments. Sort of, we can say, historical scholars have sort of retreated, into storytelling. So it's mostly about telling stories, but very little about explanation. And in fact, I wanted to go back to an earlier European tradition of history writing, in which does not shy away from analysis. And as a consequence, I think analytical thinking is nowadays more likely to be attributed to other disciplines such as political science, sociology, economics, but no longer to history. Historians are, for that reason, often not taken very serious, because we are normally assumed to be happy as satisfied with telling a good story. But history wasn't always about storytelling. In fact, I think even that applies to China. The earliest traditions of history writing in China and Europe were seen as a main way to offer explanations. So in search of explanations, of course, the historian must leave the sheltered space of history and engage with economic, sociological, and cultural studies, which I tried. So I consulted a wealth of secondary literature from other disciplines, and I thought that was often the most interesting literature, by the way. And so third, it means also, of course, you have to find a way to organize the book. And I tried to organize the book especially around, to identify patterns, causes, and consequences. So that for me was a main way to offer explanation. So you will see in some of the reviews, there have been many reviews since the book came out. Some of the reviewers, of course, point out that you find much less interest in my book in the leading personalities. There's very little, about. I mean, some of them are mentioned, of course, but it's a book that's interested in structures, right, in patterns, not so much in the in the leaders. Of course, there's some downside to it. It can also be criticized, and I'm open to discuss this later on. So, but I needed an approach. I needed something, a thought, a house of thought that brings all this together. And here, after doing some research and reading around, I have always been interested in institutions. As has been said, in criminal justice is an institution. I've always been interested in institutions, and I thought, yes, I mean, that also sets me up well for writing a book that places emphasis on institutions. Now, the word institution is used vaguely in daily language. As defined in the social sciences, institutions are written or unwritten rules, or to be more precise, there are, we can say, arrangements by human beings to achieve cooperation in a society. So institutions is not to be confused with an organization. An organization, or some organizations, are based on institutions. So the institutions, again, as I said, they are rules that allow people to collaborate, that tell you, how to, for instance, split up a work. If we agree that person A does the first phase, person B takes it from there and develops it further. So that agreement is sort of, in a very simplistic term, that's an institution. So they make it possible for people to work together smoothly based on trust that comes with sharing the rules, because we agree on certain rules, on common assumptions, expectations, and values. In a functioning institutional framework, actors are able to rely on certain procedures with predictable outcomes and therefore stick to them. And this idea or notion of institutions does not simply apply to government, but also businesses, right? There's a huge literature out there, by the way, one of the most interesting literature, that looks, for instance, at firms and companies as institutions. Some of this literature, by the way, that's why I thought this institution approach works really well for me. Some of this literature is explicitly historical. So some of the best institutional scholars, for instance, have written books on firms, the rise of, for instance, big trading companies in early modern Europe, trying to explain how these companies functioned as institutions. It's exactly that tendency that they defined rules, elaborate rules, good rules, that allowed them to prosper and flourish. So the argument here is to say these very powerful firms and companies were good institutions, were based on good institutions, and they were also able to modify these institutions as time went by. So we can see here there's another thing that allows us, that is interesting when we apply it to China. we can, as you see here, the last bullet point, explain the overall development of Chinese society, that it's shaped by institutions and their transformations. And now it becomes interesting because that also includes institutional failures and weaknesses. And the last 2 points, by the way, is something that the institutional literature, isn't very much interested in. Because most of the scholars who work look into institutions, work with institutions, they are very interested in institutional success, in explaining the success of a company. But I think it's equally interesting, to try to understand the failure of an institution and the weakness it has. So when are rules good? When do they work well? And when are rules, deficient? And so that's an institution that isn't working well. So I think if you apply the institutional approach to Chinese history, you cannot, but also be interested in the failures and weaknesses. And when we come to contemporary China, I will highlight that aspect. So I would now like to move on. What I see as the advantage, and I've said this already, understanding China not as a process driven by outside influence or intervention. And I highlight important continuities in the book. I point to a country with unique institutions. So that also allows us, I think, to much better grapple with the question that has been of such overwhelming concern to an earlier generation of scholars, namely, what role does foreign influence play? And I think when we look at the institutions and the rules, we can be much more precise. And it makes clear that foreign influence, as I will say, plays a big role in China, but it's the modification of these rules. It's when you, for instance, take a rule from, let's say, the Soviet Union and enter it into a Chinese institutional context. So I think here it becomes very clear. We can highlight and pinpoint exactly what that so-called influence is. So again, also understanding that I see that also as an advantage of my approach, understanding making China of a process not driven by outside influence and intervention, because when you transfer something into China, it still has to fit the indigenous institutional setting and context, which will always be very, very important. And I think an essential truth emerges for me, when I wrote the book, namely that China's fate really is being written domestically. I mean, again, I do not intend to downplay the role of the global context, not for a moment. But I think in the West, many have fooled themselves that they can have a major say in the development of China. And I think it's even more true today. But this is just a warning that China, as you can tell from my narrative, has always decided its own fate. And I think that is perhaps even more true today. So after, again, I'm sorry, I don't know how this, in Hai Qing, where this U came from, it was just smuggled into, perhaps, I don't know. But please ignore it and accept my apology. Now, after this lengthy introduction, I think I have about perhaps half an hour to go through some of the key insights. So let's go back to history. And let's really engage with history. The first part of the book is called not the first part, I think, but a chapter of the book is called The Age of Glory. So the book starts with the Qing dynasty, especially the Hai Qing dynasty. Because I felt that in order to understand China, we have to go at least back to the Qing dynasty. Obviously, you could also go back to much earlier in Chinese history. And it's just that I thought I can't handle that anymore. And it's earlier traditions and earlier institutions are important. Qing China doesn't, come out of the blue, but it rather already inherits very important institutions. So I tried my best in the first chapter to reflect on some of these earlier traditions, but I thought a more detailed narrative can perhaps only I can perhaps only manage the High Qing. So that's certainly also something that's open, and would need much more work than I was able to do. Why did I start with the High Qing? For one, that was an area that I was relatively familiar with, also from my earlier research, but also because the early Qing era demonstrated great strength, material efflorescence, social stability, and saw an enormous expansion of territory and population in an increasingly commercialized, but of course, primarily agrarian economy. So I was interested in showing my readers in Europe and the United States that, when we always think at China as backward or poor, that is entirely wrong, mistaken. And when we deal with China and look at Chinese history, the first thing we have to recognize is that is a country that was occupied once already a leading position in the world. It had industries that were among the world's most advanced. And here you see a porcelain, and in my book, the porcelain part plays a big role. This porcelain is one of the products that China produced in great quantity and quality, and which made it a huge export product to Europe. In fact, China for several centuries, especially then in the early modern period, earned a lot of foreign currency, silver for most part, through its porcelain trade. The porcelain trade, there's now a book out there that goes into detail this, but by the time my book was published, that wasn't available. But this book also highlights, as tries my book, to show that these were huge quantities. There were hundreds of thousands of pieces of porcelain produced and shipped, during 1 year, and millions of it over several years. Porcelain was expensive, and it sold exclusively to the European elites, and who bought porcelain, and therefore, again, as I said, it was a huge source of income for China. And I think it was a big part of the Chinese development in commercialization. We have already a global market at that time, and it's easy to underestimate it, but it provided China with the cash and the income to develop its own economy. So it was a surplus economy. It's like it's actually similar like today when China sells so much to the global market. Now, porcelain is perhaps often also seen as more of a piece of art or artisan work, but porcelain is really also an industry, and we can look at it as an industry. And I think in China it was an industry. It was an institution, a very successful institution based on a very sophisticated division of labor, from getting the earth and burning it, designing it. So sophisticated was this trade that China did not only cater to the tastes of Europe, but also to other parts in the world. And since I visited, if you go to a museum, for instance, in Qatar, there's this great museum, by the way, from IMP, Islamic Art Museum, and you see Chinese porcelain in it that uses, however, Islamic symbols and patterns. So you have to see these were truly global companies in China that understood to produce porcelain that fitted exactly the European taste and use in the kitchen. So they brought back from Europe an understanding of European customers and their preferences. And they did this, as I said, very well. Porcelain is very important also for the development of European kitchen, because without porcelain, it's very difficult to consume hot food. You could put it on a wooden plate, but it's not very hygienic. And you can't use the wooden because the wooden surface takes in all the fluids. So it becomes a source of sickness. But once you use porcelain, which can be kept very clean, and also it allows you to touch hot food, which, for instance, if you use bronze or metal, isn't possible. You know, don't even try ever to touch, you know, a hot metal cup when you poured hot water in it, because it basically doesn't insulate the same way porcelain does. So it's very important for the development of cuisine and eating habits in Europe. That's why porcelain is so important. So it's really about this practical use of porcelain that makes it so useful and that made China such a. And I also in the book point out, however, that this big trade for China, big surplus trade for China, however, vanishes more or less completely in the beginning of the 19th century. And so a big source of income falls away. And so this becomes for me a major explanation for the changes in China. So again, you see earlier explanations have often looked to Confucian unwillingness to reform, or a blindness of China, or that backward China encounters the much modern West. I make it much more a story that could happen today again, everywhere, when a flourishing economy hits the wall, enters periods of recession and depression, and that leads to all sorts of institutional weaknesses. We will go there in a second, but let me just say what happened. How is it possible that porcelain, which was the export product, much like German cars today, what happens if porcelain, how is it possible that it disappeared or vanished? Well, very simple. Something that we often accuse China of today happened in Europe at this time. The technique of producing porcelain was simply stolen from China, copied. European merchants and Arab merchants brought back the recipe of how to produce good porcelain. They learned it from China. They looked at, you know, you have to have the exact heating temperature. You have the good clay. Similar clay was found in Saxony, here in Germany. And it was reproduced in Meissen. And they experimented and said, well, we have to be able to produce the same product like the Chinese. And it took them a couple of years. But after a couple of years of experimentation, they sort of reverse manufactured. They stole the recipe from China. They reverse manufactured, reproduced it in Europe. Once this was done, the King of Saxony built a big manufacturer and produced porcelain of a comparable quality. But now, of course, since it's produced in Europe, it's much cheaper. You don't have the transportation costs. So within a couple of decades, porcelain is produced everywhere in Europe. Once they know the technology, they produce it, and the market is gone for China. And so porcelain, which was by far the most important, can no longer be sold to early modern Europe. So this is just one of the interesting things that tell us about the changes underway in China. In the book, and for reasons of time, I cannot go in, I also look at silver, because there are also currency fluctuations in the world market that have to do with events in Latin America. But my point here to make it short is, even at this time, there is the global economy. It's very difficult. It's unpredictable. It goes through ups and downs. And these changes in the global economy have an enormous impact on any country in the world, including, of course, China. So then, of course, I move on, and I'm interested in the 19th century crisis. And I'm sorry, that's a very complicated PowerPoint here. But it is also a very complicated story. So again, I thought overwhelmingly this downfall of China in the 19th century that we know very well about, that we are very familiar with from the historical literature, has offered very simplified explanations. Not that they are wrong, but there was no single one factor. to explain what happened in China. So as I think if we look at, difficulties and crises that countries go through, there's never really only one factor. It's much more complicated. So as I highlighted already, the global economy plays a different role. And that is for sure. And I think there's also ecological constraints that play a big role. If you look at the 19th century in China, for instance, you see the Yellow River shifting its course immensely, right, from Shandong to the south of China in Jiangsu, which afflicts a huge area. I mean, it's really, after we've seen the pictures of floods today in China, this year in China, you have to imagine what happens if the Yellow River shifts its course over hundreds of kilometers, destroying, and this happens for many years, right? It's not, if a river shifts its bed in such a dramatic fashion, that's not just a one-year thing, that's over a couple of years where water, looks for different riverbeds to flow. So that has something to do with environmental degradation, and I cannot go into it again. But I also, perhaps what distinguishes my book also from other books is that I place more emphasis on the environment. Perhaps, not only perhaps, but I'm sure there could be done more. The information that we have is often very limited, but it is clear that China was deforested already in the early Qing era, that China enters the modern period already as a country under heavy pressure from ecological degradation. It's really severe, right? And leads to droughts, leads to soil erosion. And that soil erosion, as we all know, also is one of the causes for the shifts for rivers to overflow because of the silt at their bottom and for the change of the Yellow River. It made, and this of course was also exaggerated by a change in global climate patterns, which I show. For instance, there is also El Nino phenomenon in the 19th century. And therefore, for instance, in the 19th century, we have this huge famine in North China that happens right at the exact time when there's also a huge famine in Ireland, as well as in the Ukraine in Eastern Europe. So, that climate has also always been global. And so when global changes, which perhaps at that time had nothing to do with global warming, but global changes encounter local ecological degradation, it produces catastrophes. And now with global warming, I think we will see this much more often, but it's not, but it has happened in history before. And I think it's very important to understand. So second, this of course puts pressure on, this increases poverty in rural China. So also one of my theses in this book is to say China in the 19th century was a much poorer place than in the 18th century. Living standards in general were in many places higher in the 18th century than in the 19th century. It's also often that's something overlooked, I think, in history, that what happens, for instance, if poverty, poverty is not just a country is poor and then it becomes rich, but what can happen is also that wealth can disappear and poverty can reappear, right? And in history, actually, that's almost normal if you really think back of it. So in many places, many areas, for instance, in Shandong, Henan in North China, people had higher living standards in the 18th century and in the 19th century. And for instance, this is where I looked into other disciplines. There are interesting work by demographers and geographers, and I must say I love these academic disciplines because they are so precise. And they calculate calorie intakes from the sources that they have, and they show us, that people, in fact, had a higher living standard in the 18th century. And so that's one of the effects. Then, of course, the effects of imperialism, and I don't want to go too much into this, but it deepened the economic woes. And as I said, that has something to do with silver, and then, of course, the opium trade. So now things have turned around. While China used to sell so much more to Europe, now, of course, there are European products that are sold to China in ever-growing quantities, and this includes textiles, other things like watches, of course, fossil fuel, especially petroleum that is used for lighting, and so on and so forth. These are, again, these are products that Chinese find extremely useful, especially petroleum, finds its place into almost every household. And opium is, of course, one part of the story, but it's not the only part of the story. Even without opium, this is hypothetical, I admit it, but even without opium, perhaps, or most likely, there would be much more European products sold to the Chinese market than vice versa. And that leads to outflows of silver. While in the 18th century, China gained silver from the global market, it now loses silver. And so that leads to falling prices and dwindling rural income. So it makes everything worse. Again, you see how I try to emphasize that Chinese scholarship, of course, places imperialism. It's all about imperialism in the 19th century. But you see changes in global economy, ecological constraints, imperialism, spreading poverty, they all work together. It's not the single factor. It's all these factors working together that now push China also in a political crisis because they increase domestic unrest. People are hungry, they can't make money on the countryside. They, of course, organize. This is not a Marxist revolution, a political revolution, but rather they believe the Taiping leader, that he's God's Chinese son, calls to arms to topple a corrupt dynasty, or they follow other, associations, fraternity, triads, it doesn't matter. But people are unhappy, they are in need, they are poor, they suffer, and they organize. And that leads then, of course, to political institution, to political instability. The ruling dynasty loses its support. It's seen as corrupt, as foreign, as Manchu. And also the empire fails to address the problems. It fails to find an effective solution for dealing with economic downturn, regional imbalances, rural poverty, and social unrest. And by the way, it's not that they didn't understand. It's not. Because sometimes in the literature, it's seen as, well, a Confucian China didn't understand what a global market economy is. They did understand. There were recent research has uncovered that there were all sorts of discussions about currencies, about the market, about the role of the government in the market. There were texts pointing to poverty. There were texts, of course, arguing to revive institutions, earlier institutions, to deal with domestic unrest and so on. So there was a lot of ideas out there. So it's not that they didn't know what to do. The proposals were all there. But some of these proposals were not allowed to be printed. There was government censorship. Some of the scholars were, in fact, persecuted. They were suppressed. And why? Because, in my reading, China's leadership failed to respond to the new challenges because it was a tight web of vested interests and rent-seeking behavior that had sort of captured Qing institutions. The Qing institutions could not agree on the need to act, much less on a specific plan. Political power continued to be concentrated in the hands of the weakened Manchu court, and the court and its Chinese elites were above all concerned with protecting vested interests in maintaining power. And of course, we know that. Several reform movements were also pressed because the leading dynasty was afraid that it would lose power. So with this priority overruling all other considerations, institutional changes and reforms were avoided for fear of undermining the rule of the Manchu dynasty. So the root cause of this crisis can be found in the closely aligned incentives of the bureaucracy and the scholarly, commercial, and land-owning elites. This created this tight web of interests, vested interests in rent-seeking behavior, which, once established, impeded change. So in the end, I think this is a story that we can find in many other places as well, and I call it capture. If institutions that were produced or set up to allow people to collaborate become sort of distorted or captured by the interests of an elite that now wants to extract resources for its own sake. Okay, I move on now, and I think we'll have 2 more slides, so I will talk for about another 10 more minutes. Oh, I'm sorry. So now I have to be, short, because actually now in the book we are about half of the pages. It's about a 700 book, and we are now half, and we enter the 21st century, which I try to show is sort of, there are important historical legacies, but also the understanding that China needs to undergo sustained institutional innovation. And this is something very contested. And I think it allows us to understand the 20th century as a century of contestation. There's this big crisis, there is capture of the institutions don't work anymore, and there's an understanding that they need to be replaced or reformed. So much of the development then is either about reforming the existing institutions or replacing them. So it means abolishing completely. So it's a change. Therefore, this process of overcoming institutional weaknesses and dysfunctionalities that are inherited from the catastrophe, from the difficulties of the 19th century. For me, that's the overarching theme that goes through all the periods and the decades of the 20th century. And of course, different political tendencies offer different solutions. But they all start from the same diagnosis, that China needs to reinvent itself in a way in the 20th century in order to withstand foreign challenges, but also to reclaim the earlier position of centrality. So, and they do this, for instance, they do several things. So much as I said, in the discussion in 20th century, China is about the destruction, the modification, and the innovation of institutions in China. So in a nutshell, I try to understand this process in the 20th century as a process of overcoming weaknesses, dysfunctionalities. So throughout the 20th century, there were many experiments, revolutions, reforms of the institutional order, drawing on China's own experiments, but on a wide and highly selective range of foreign models. So China never followed only one foreign model, obviously. I mean, it's obvious, right, in the 20th century, but several. But this is important. I think we have to make an important conclusion, namely that the result is a hybrid and unique institutional mixture that we still see in the present, whose internal contradictions explain frequent policy shifts and an inherent instability. So if we look today, in today's China, but I think it also applies to mid-century China about 60, 70 years ago, that you see different things coexisting next to each other within one framework. State-owned enterprises, huge, super successful global companies. You'll find people in modern tertiary sectors working, programming computers next to, I think, earlier traditions of family businesses and so on. This is just, let's say, of the economy. We could say the same thing about the government or other areas. So it's hybrid. And of course, China could use important historical legacies, and that gave it an advantage, especially, I think, using some of the pre-modern Chinese institutions, such as an ingrained emphasis on education, the long experience of having run such a complex administrative organization as the Chinese imperial bureaucracy, and the unmatched experience in administering a huge and multicultural space. Actually, this is something that I'm very fascinated about, because we often completely ignore this huge Chinese bureaucracy that basically has always been in place in 20th century China. So I wish somebody would write a history, of the Chinese administration in 20th century. And I often think that because it's needed, in China, that is underestimated of how important, how sophisticated, how complex, this organization is. And I think this applies to Republican China as well as to China after 49. So let me also say that the historical legacy allowed it also to adopt a broad range of novel institutions. This comes from planned economy of the Soviet Union, includes, of course, other things that are learned from the United States or transferred from the United States and other parts of the world. So China's development is, on the one hand, relying on its own strengths and selective learning that I think allows us to characterize the development in the 20th century. The political ambitions are clear, to maintain China and to reclaim its lost position in the world. It also skillfully uses global opportunities. It aligns itself with different powers in the 20th century. It's not very loyal in this, by the way, right? I mean, first it works with the big brother in the Soviet Union, then it seeks a very close alliance with the United States, but it's very skillful in using this, and therefore is able to obtain a lot of foreign help also, and opening of global markets and so on. So these are, for me, the macro developments of China in the 20th century that, taken together, have allowed it to find solutions to some of the historical problems that we had, that were above all poverty, that had something to do with the political stability, and it allowed it also to deal with some other lack of technological progress, healthcare, you name it. So we have to admit, and I think we have to see, China has made great progress in very many areas, and it is this 4 macro trends, in my perspective: ambition, institutional innovation, important historical legacies, but also this clever way to use global opportunities that allowed China to go through this success, or to achieve these successes in some areas. But, and that's my last slide, but some things are unresolved and make China actually, despite the fact that it looks so strong, make it actually a very vulnerable country. So it's unfinished. And I think the biggest unresolved issue facing China is the need for political reform. So in the early 20th century, let's again have a historical perspective on this. In the early 20th century, China removed political institutions that have been key to past stability of the empire. Most notably, they removed the emperor, the examination system also that was quickly reintroduced, or reintroduced soon afterwards, local chantry and so on. The religions, right, is something, and the role of religions that was, at least for time, attacked. And to replace these, China cherry-picked from the global menu of political institutional models, and it opted for a constitutional monarchy, which failed, a constitutional republic, which failed. It tried military dictatorship in the warlord period. It tried a Chinese version of fascism in the 1930s. It tried several forms of state socialism, including Stalinism in the 50s and the Chinese variant Maoism in the 1960s. Now, if we look at all these political experiments, this working with different political models, they have one characteristic in common. They were all extractive, what I call extractive political institutions, meaning they extract power from society and monopolize it or concentrate it in the hands of a narrow elite, such as military officers or party leaders. So while China experimented with many theories and ideas, its rulers showed little interest in building institutions that allowed for power to be distributed widely or to support political pluralism. So even after 1978, no convincing, enduring, or institutional equivalent to the country's economic liberalization has been established. On the contrary, there's a decoupling. The liberalization of the economy is in contradiction, to the exclusive political institution. So exclusive institution is an institution that actually excludes a lot of people. You have to be a party member and you have to be ideologically, loyal and stable and so on and so forth. It's very exclusive. Whether the country's development can continue if China pursues long delayed political reform is, I think, an open question. Also, all the 20th century governments in China have won power on the battlefield and have, I would say, weak legitimacy, or at least they cannot be sure how much support they have in the government. And we know now, if we look at China today, there's an overwhelming concern whether or not people support the government, and they simply cannot know. As power was won on the battlefield, it's defended with police and secret police and so on. We know that, and through repression and censorship, they cannot know. And so this fundamentally comprised the ability to govern. These governments are likely to face more open or secret dissent. They see perhaps opposition to their policies and have to resort to ever more repression. So politics forged on the battlefield and run through by military campaigns lack this, legitimate basis. And of course, something like economic growth can make up for that deficit, but only to a point. So I think that exposes the system in China to systemic risk. Ideological campaigns and nationalism, as we all know, are used to buttress the government in critical moments, but I think it's difficult to upheld this, or at least unpredictable whether it can be upheld for a long time. So to conclude this here, it may therefore seem today, as it seemed under Mao's China, that the CCP is in total control, and the country is clearly moving, to this vision of the leader's vision. And however, I think there's a mismatch between China's appearance and its real footprint. Some of the successes are undeniable, but the weaknesses are there also. China is an influential member in the world, but it's only loosely integrated. China often stands alone if you look at the world, never fully succeeded in winning close allies. Right? China is perhaps a country that really doesn't have really close allies, and perhaps the best allies that China today has is Pakistan and North Korea, and these are some of the poorest countries in the world. So strongman politics and the big, in propaganda cannot conceal, I think, profound weakness. Historically, and here's where history in the 19th century plays such a big role to me, when institutions were exhausted and unstable, it allowed for and even facilitated the ability of leaders to gain greater control and power. In the 19th century, when we now in historical hindsight know the political institutions destabilized, it wasn't necessarily the case for the contemporaries to see, because on the outside, it looked like it always was the same, sort of glory. So I think as a consequence, just as in the past, periods past, China's government can be at once powerful and powerfully insecure. So it may be less China's renewal than its profound anxieties and unresolved issues that will shape the world in the 21st century. So I stop here, and I want to thank you very much for listening to me. And that is a last, oh yeah, let me say this is a slide that shows my campus here, or one of the buildings, or one angle of our campus here at Lake Constance. And also I wanted to say one more thing. There's also a Chinese translation being published in Taiwan. I don't know exactly where it stands, but it should come out soon. So again, thank you very much. So now I'll leave it to you and end the presentation.
Thank you so much for Professor Mühlhahn's very important talk about today's Taiwanese scholar who want to study China, because this book, I'm so glad that we are going to have this book available in Taiwan, because then I can assign this book to my college students. Yeah. Before then, I think that the most important things that Professor Mühlhahn point out is the importance of macro history. The idea of macro history in our understanding of modern China. For a very long time, we use events, we use individuals to understand the history of modern China, rather than have some macro and less political correct explanation about modern Chinese history. So I think that's why some book reviewers, they praise Professor Mühlhahn's book, that a book that can continue or they can continue the discussion done by John Fairbank and Jonathan Spence, the explanation about China. The most important step made by Professor Mühlhahn is, in addition to Fairbank's idea about how Western power changed China, and the Professor Jonathan Spence's idea about China's central explanation about Chinese history, Professor Mühlhahn offer a more detailed, eventually in terms of the understanding of technology and institution advanced, before 1949 in China. And this book really, I think, will kind of remind me of something I read when I was a PhD student at Brown University. I remember I read one of my minor is pre-modern European history, and then my advisor assigned a book to me and want me to read. It's a book about Reformation. And in China and in Taiwan, we learn Reformation as a top-down movement, from the government to the people. And I remember the very last sentence of the book. The book say the Reformation is not done to the people, but done within the people. I think Professor Mühlhahn's lecture and certainly remind me of this. To think how change, not caused by the so-called ruler to the ruled, but done by the common people, or the common people's desire to have a better life. And in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, Professor Mühlhahn's book offer a more European approach to our understanding of modern Chinese history. And it also reminds me another thing that I learned when I was a graduate student in Taiwan. And to me, European approach to history is almost equal to French non-school approach to history, which means they emphasize the importance of geography, and they emphasize the importance of technology. And some critiques to the non-school's approach to history is, okay, so where is people? So what is the importance of individuals? Eventually, in Professor Mühlhahn's book, you mention something really very important. You say, oh, we lack the understanding of the China's well-reasoned political responses. Yeah, eventually in your first book. And I kind of wondering, after listening to your wonderful lectures about modern China, I kind of wondering, you kind of want to skip by the past explanation done by the scholar about revolutions or revolutionaries. But how will you use the approach now you have to readdress the importance of human or the human mentality, all the way from the institution to the mentality? How will you tell us a macro history of this change? I'm kind of can wait to to know your response to that. Also, I promise to myself I will definitely assign this book to my undergrad student. Why? Because this book also offer a very important explanation about 19th century Chinese history. Officially consists of a lot of cutting edge scholars' work, officially about environmental history. One of my close friend, his name is Michael Muscolino. Yeah, his book is he used the environmental history approach to understand modern Chinese history. It's such a hit actually among my students. And this book and Professor Mühlhahn's book kind of introduce officially the so-called global issues. The global issues in terms of climate change, to our understanding of modern China, and to use this to help us to address the real crisis caused by the time since 19th century. So I think that's why I really learned from today's today's in the lecture. And the next things also Professor Mühlhahn mentioned the importance of innovations or the lack of innovations since the late 19th centuries. I think it is very, very interesting to me, because recently my very recent project is actually about Fuzhou, the Fuzhou in Fujian, and I'm studying so-called local firefighter associations. And what happened to this local firefighter associations all the way from 1850s to 1949. And I kind of want to understand how different governments want to deal with them. Yeah, and how they deal with the issue or the crisis issued by the different governments. So I think the innovation issues is very important. Actually, Chinese people, they are good at use any available discourse or techniques to address the problem they deal in their daily life experience. Okay, and the final question is kind of strike me to think about these issues, because to a lot of Taiwanese people, all the way from scholars to the so-called common citizens, we need to deal with the issue of the threats coming from China today. And like Professor Mühlhahn mentioned in the very last part of your lectures, China need a political reform. And this political reform is kind of remind your approach to the political reforms. It's kind of remind me of my late advisor, Professor Philip Kuhn. Philip Kuhn's the book, The Origin of Modern China. In that book, Kuhn mentions there are 3 constitutional questions we need to address for our understanding of modern China. That would be political participation, political context, and political controls. And I kind of use this idea to understand what happened in local politics. But to think about what happened in our daily life about President about Xi Jinping, it's kind of interesting to think his idea about what is his idea of the so-called ideal political system. So far, we can see what he really insists is he said only the CCP could have political power, or only they could do the great job. So that's why they need to connect themselves, CCP, to the history. The history equal to the CCP, and the history is all about achievements done by the CCP. And I kind of want to, this book published, the professor Mühlhahn, this book published in 2019. So it's right before the start of the trade wars between China and the United States. Even a few hours ago, we learned there's a big nuclear submarine, crash with something we don't know in South China Sea. So it's a lot of things happening right now, and I kind of want to know what would you say about today's Xi Jinping and his China? Eventually, as a historian, I studied local politics, and I also need to do a lot of field work, especially in China. I have to say, China, like Professor Mühlhahn said, is an amazing place because it kind of, you cannot use just very simple, standard to understand China. If my dissertation is my PhD dissertation is about Wenzhou. So in Wenzhou, then we understand, wow, there are 8 dialects in Wenzhou. The different people talk about different dialects, and but sometimes they think differently, but sometimes they think probably the same. It depends on the issues. So it's kind of, want me to, invite me, let me to think about when I was doing my fieldwork in Wenzhou is actually from 2008 to 2012. And the time is kind of, China is, well, you can say a lot of freedom. You can do a lot of things. Yeah, so when we talk about Xi Jinping, probably we should also think about the importance of China all the way from Jiang Zemin, 1989 to 2012. The most innovation that I earlier mentioned is not done by the government, it's done by the people. So kind of, my remark, my response to you today's wonderful lecture is actually, okay, so we need a macro history of people too. Yeah, so and I'm kind of, can wait to know what would you say about, these questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This is marvelous points that you raised. Absolutely fascinating, intriguing, and very thoughtful. So thank you very much, for taking the time to engage with this. I start with your last point, this macro history of the people, and I absolutely agree with you for the need for that. And so some of the questions that I had to deal with while writing the book is to balance structure and human agency, right? So you have structure on the one hand, rules and so on, and then you have on the other hand, of course, human agency. And obviously we know that rules, can be followed, but they can also not be followed, right? I mean, it happens all the time.
Yes.
And so humans can distort, can change, can modify the rules, can undermine the rules, and so on. So you are absolutely right that human agency is a decisive factor. And it's something, by the way, that most of the institutional scholars in the field have not been able to explain very well. But I think we as historians, we can. So I tried to balance in my book. I tried to show, at least at some points in time, at crucial moments in Chinese history, where human agency comes in. And this often takes on the form then of, let's say, unpredictable and sudden change that, perhaps, was very hard to foresee. So for instance, let me give you an extreme example of human agency in Chinese history, which of course also implies not just the regular people, I say something about this, but as the leader. So there are certainly moments in China, for instance, at the beginning of the Second World War, where one person, one human alone changed almost everything in a short period of time. So in the book, I'm talking really about Cheng Xueliang and the so-called Xi'an incident, right? Yeah. We now know from Russian archives, we have more information than we used to have. So it becomes pretty clear that Cheng Xueliang was in contact with the communists already, But then, you know, he took things in his own hand in a way that was not coordinated with the communists, nor with anybody else, right? He is sort of a person who, for that reason, and he imprisons or keeps Chiang Kai-shek arrested for 30 days, for 20 days, 2 weeks.
20 days,
yeah. And then before that, and then after that, he releases him. But this action has changed a lot. This action, for instance, you know, allowed China to mobilize against the Japanese. It allowed Soviet Union, you know, to cease or reduce its support for the communists. And I argue it also, by the way, because you know, it also allowed you know, to shift military resources to Europe. So maybe you know, maybe I'm over exaggerating, but for me, it's just one of the things that was not supposed to happen, but happens nonetheless. And there are other examples like this. I think there's also examples where you can say, for instance, you know, where certain popular uprisings and so on, all of a sudden get an oversized influence and are able to topple a lot of things. So, and I still, by the way, think why, you know, you asked, I wrote, this book was published in 19, I wrote it in 90, basically I finished in 2018. There's also a German version that I updated on the Xi Jinping part. But I still think, you know, that we have this strong belief in rules and institutions. So we cannot think of a world, you know, that the world can topple. Earlier, you know, that things can change quickly. Actually, much quicker than you think. I think here you asked about the European perspective. This is an experience that we in Europe, and especially I got from my grandmother, who was often talking about the 1930s and 20s, and some of the things that they could not foresee, that they could not understand, but that they happened, you know, influence their own lives. So we have these two periods, you know, of human agency, leaders and people that are important. So I'm totally with you on this, and thank you very much for pointing it out. And let me say your last question. I wanted to address this as well, and because the German, just you know, the German version was updated German version and corrected German version was published a couple of weeks ago. And I added a whole chapter on Xi Jinping to bring it up to date. And this is, you know, you're absolutely right. There is the strength of China, that's for sure. I try to highlight that there are also implicit victories, implicit weaknesses. And I think it's very hard to understand where China is going today, these days. Again, you know, I'm reminded of your point, the significance of the human factor. Because, you know, it's certainly not only one person, not Xi Jinping, but it's certainly also the case that he brings with himself capability and skills, you know, to play a role that others have not. You know, Hu Jintao certainly wasn't. And he is, for whatever reason, he is on the stage and he has been able to extend control and hold things together to a degree that that is quite surprising. And and so also, you know, in my analysis is that the perspective, some like Xi Jinping and others in the party do see that China is in a very difficult spot. Because it has grown, but its economic model can perhaps not be continued. It has also, when we said, you know, look, think back in my talk, when we said it used global opportunities, China is depending on the world, but the world is alienated from China. You know, there's growing mistrust. Again, you know, the world is no longer that open like it was 20 years ago. And internally, I think Xi Jinping and the party face a highly diverse society, as you just said, you know, Wenzhou, it's a remarkable place, so many dialects, so many different people, such a complex society, rich now wealthy, with successful entrepreneurs, and the party faces this huge challenge of how can it maintain a communist party rule in this very difficult circumstances. So, and I think actually that the party sees the difficulties exactly the same way, like I tried to outline here. But the conclusion that obviously parts in the party drew is, because China is in a difficult place, we need to maintain ideological control. We need to maintain party control. We need to increase censorship. But it's a response to the same situation. Now, will this work? Nobody knows. Nobody from us knows. And again, I think you made a marvelous point. You know, when we point to the human factor, we really don't know. And everything, you know, but it's one thing is sure: China enters a very, very complicated and risky phase in its development. I don't know. Did I address all the questions, or is there something left open? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we still have. Thank you so much, Professor Mühlhahn's very insightful answers to my questions. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and we still have like 20 minutes left. Yeah, and now we can take some questions. Any? Yeah. Oh yeah, Professor Liao, please.
Yeah.
No, there's one in the chat.
Oh, one in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read it and answer it, or?
Oh yeah, you can read it and you can answer it, just at your convenience.
Okay. Yeah. So so there is a question here, and that says, in the beginning, you mentioned that social and economic change, more than ideology, have transformed and shaped modern China. Do you still think this will be the case in the future? What could be the main shaping force in China's future? Yeah, that's a great question. Very difficult question. I'm always uncomfortable because as an historian, I always look back. But I do accept the point that it's also important to look forward into the future. You know, by highlighting social and economic changes and also cultural changes, I should say, I try to sort of bring the Western reader away through this overall obsession with politics. And I think when we look at China today, we also highlight ideology, right? So of course, China portrays itself as a communist country that unwaveringly, you know, sticks to its roots. So, you know, what did Xi Jinping say? I mean, this is really so interesting in the sense he produces a lot of good quotes for later historians all the time. And we have to say he's much better in this than his predecessor. You know, that he always says, you know, China will never, you know, waver in its commitment to communism. Yeah, China will never give up. China will always be under a communist rule. He also says, you know, it's a success that will, you know, that is of an historical level, and that the CCP, because it has been so successful, it will always be the leader of China, and the Chinese people can only trust the CCP. So this is the sort of ideology, and you have highlighted also that this implies history writing, right? So the history is being rewritten as a history where the Chinese Communist Party, you know, not only liberated, but led China to greatness again. But I wouldn't trust it. You know, the party displays this, you know, big conviction and this, and it trumps it with a fanfare, a big fanfare, and so on. But I don't think that people in China are really, you know, so many are really buying into this. And I have to admit, though, that my circle of friends in China is limited. But I know not of a single friend, and there are younger people, students of mine, people in business, even people in the party. I don't know anybody who really buys into that wholesale, right? I mean, there is nationalism and national pride for sure. That is increasing. But so many of my friends say, this, we don't know what to do with this. And some of these theories, some the other day when we talked on video, he said, it's so stupid. It's so I don't think I wouldn't overestimate. So I don't think that the development in China is driven by ideology, but I do think it's driven by fear, the fear of the party to lose power and privilege and money and wealth. Because I mean, there's exciting new research out there, that again shows, so people call it the crony capitalism, right? It's on a scale that is just amazing and breathtaking. And so of course, Xi Jinping tries to control it, but we don't know, and that's my question, we don't know whether repression, corruption campaigns, can really control the situation. So if we look to the future, I still think the major questions will be whether China and the party finds the power, the energy to do these reforms. And one final remark. I just have published with good friends, with Timothy Cheek and Hans van der Veen, a book about a Chinese Communist Party, 100 years. And I have written a chapter on Zhao Ziyang. So the need for political reform, because often people, when I say this, they say, well, but that's your Western perspective. Here again, you highlight that China needs to be democratic. And we can point to Zhao Ziyang and others, Hu Yaoban, and even to a certain degree, Wen Jiabao, who was prime minister until a couple of years ago, as people in the party, leaders in the party, who were convinced that China needs to reform its political system. And Zhao Ziyang, I must say, I admire this guy because he accepted house arrest for the rest of his life, but refused, to go public and denounce his actions. So he was a very I think, committed person. So the idea that China's problem, that China will sooner or later run into chaos or catastrophe, when it doesn't reform its political institutions, it's something that is discussed in China, in the party, or at least has been before Xi Jinping.
Mm-hmm.
Klaus?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, please. Yeah, Professor Liao, please.
Can I ask you a question? Yeah. Let's shift the focus a little bit, maybe back to your more familiar parameters. I have thought about this phenomena for a long time. The fact that, the BRICS, these 5 countries, which were supposed to be, economically on the rise and may eventually become a new kind of block of influences. Now over not very long, maybe 10 years, I think most of them squander their fortunes. For Brazil, India to a certain extent, Russia, and South Africa definitely is going downhill. But it seems to me that China at least has been reinvested much of his the fortune that he's accumulated into the major infrastructural work. So what is the reason that make China kind of special in this group? And what are the reasons behind this fact? I mean, you have actually both Brazil and India as democratic institutions, or actually South Africa too. Yeah. But of course, there's so much differences among these different societies. But I'm interested in how you would respond to this, because you are probably one of the best people to give an explanation to this interesting phenomenon.
Well, thank you. It's a great question. It's absolutely fascinating, and I would like to start with your last observation. So it's obviously not that democratic institutions alone, can guarantee development or guarantee prosperous, wealth or a prosperous society. So that alone in itself is not sufficient, because, I mean, it's obviously, or let me take this up later. And because your first question was, how explains that China is going a different way, and I agree with you. In regard to the analysis of all the other parts of the world, of the BRICS group, and the development there, problems they encounter, and China has behaved differently. And again, in the book, I try to argue that it's historical sort of legacy that allowed China to behave differently. So commitment to infrastructure is something that I think we can see very clearly in Imperial China. Commitment to infrastructure, for instance, think about waterworks, canals, irrigation systems, even road maintenance. So coming from this huge empire with enormous logistical challenges, China has always maintained a strong commitment to building infrastructure, both for military purposes, but also for economic purposes. China's big advantage always was that it's a huge, rather, I think, integrated market where you can actually sell goods without paying taxes or changing language. Well, you have different dialects and different taxation systems and different weights and different currencies. So this commitment to infrastructure is quite remarkable. So for instance, think about that even in the beginning of the 20th century, the Kuomintang government already quadrupled, the rail lines in China. It's often overlooked, but Chiang Kai-shek invested heavily, in building in infrastructure. And so I think that allowed China to take a different path. The second thing that I also think is an historical institution in a way is this huge commitment to education and science and technology. So the most modern universities in China include, were founded at the beginning of the 20th century, even before Kuomintang ruled, right? So education, huge investments into maintaining schools, running good schools, and so on. Also in the book, I play a heavy emphasis on the examination system. So the idea that you actually select the most talented people, not because of their birthright, because they are aristocrats, or because anything, but everybody gets to have a fair chance in the examination system. I mean, it's never that ideal, we know that, but it still makes a big difference whether you, for instance, select people through examinations or through something else. And let me add, even, it's often overlooked, even in the Communist Party, to enter the Communist Party and then to rise in the Communist Party, you have to go through several, examinations, trainings, and so on. It's not that easy in the public, So for instance, in the Soviet Union, that wasn't the case like it is in China. So these are, for me, historical traditions that play a role and explain China's success. And that's my whole point to say, China's success is not so much an enlightened communist leadership, but some of the earlier traditions that brought, so that skills that China brought with itself, ideas that brought with itself, that explain its success. And now I wanted to say something about these democratic institutions. As you said, and here perhaps I'm becoming, I'm overly pessimistic. But the thing is, and I think if my analysis of China is correct, that we now see a China in today where institutions are captured by special interest, a tight web of interest that undermine the one-party system, and Xi Jinping's effort is a last mobilization, to fight against these tendencies. And unfortunately, we see the same thing in Russia. We see the same thing in parts of India. We see the same thing in Turkey, by the way, and in the Western democracies. So I think we are entering in the world globally a period where where elites have sort of taken hold of the top of the pyramid, right? And are using it to extract and enrich themselves. And that is now, I think, perhaps, and they are also around in tight, intermeshed, interwoven. This is an integrated elite. Let's not fool ourselves for a minute. They are on good terms, regardless of their nationality, and this has become a major political risk in our time.
Great, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially like the part about it, historical legacies, because few people really actually think in this direction.
Yeah, we still have like almost 8 minutes. I like to use my privilege as a moderator to ask Professor Mühlhahn another questions. When I was visiting student in Shanghai, and actually in Huadong Sifan University, and there was a rumor saying, oh, the faculty members in Huadong Sifan University, Shen Zhihua and Yang Huisong, they were invited, to Beijing to teach, to teach actually the national leader about history. So, Professor Mühlhahn, can I ask you, if you got the chance to offer a history course based on your book to Xi Jinping, what would your suggestion, or the course or the question you want him to think, or the solution you will offer, based on your understanding of history? I think that would be very interesting question to think.
Yes, no, that's really interesting. I don't think I would be invited in the first place. But and I there has been I have been contacted by publishers on the mainland as well as Hong Kong for Chinese translations, but they couldn't do it. They couldn't. So the only Chinese edition will be a Taiwanese tradition, which I think is fantastic. I love that. I think it tells us also about why Taiwan is important, right? Because this is the only place left in Chinese language where these things are allowed to be printed and produced. And even Hong Kong had to excuse even the Hong Kong publishers, and they approached me in the beginning, but in the end they didn't get the permission or felt it would be too risky to publish in Hong Kong. It tells us how bad the situation has become in China. And now why is that? Because, and that's, so you ask me, what would I tell Xi Jinping that he doesn't want to hear? And what I would tell that he doesn't want to hear is, which is also in the book, for me was very important, the strong democratic tradition that we have in China that precedes the country. It's so often ignored. But China in the early 20th century was intrigued by the idea of democracy, as we as historians know. The late Qing intellectuals, were intrigued. And from that time onward, the idea of participation, what you said about Kuhn, by the way, a book that I love, that Philip Kuhn was one of the most important books, of the modern state for me. It had big influence on me. And so, the question of participation, of constitutional rights, of what you can, how do you, what are the limits of government power and authority? So important issues have been taken on again and again in China, even within the party, of course. Yes. And so that would be my wish, to recognize this, that there is not only the dream about a wealthy and strong China, but there are also Chinese who have dreamt and are still dreaming about a party that's freer, where you're allowed to discuss, where you're allowed to have different ideas, where you can make your own choices. And I think I would also point to the human suffering and the, what it means to be restricted, to not be allowed, to be free. I'm not a Cold War warrior, and I don't want to tell China what to do. But from history, I can only say that these were great idealists, and they had a lot of supporters in China. Aiming for a more open, a more liberal, and a more democratic China. And I think the world needs it.
Yeah. And what would you say to Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen, based on your book?
Well, so right now, my book has also something that made me very unhappy while I wrote it, that I didn't include Taiwan, and that did not include Hong Kong. And that is simply, if you write such a book, there are so many restrictions you have. You have the publisher, you have your own ideas. The publisher won't accept, they are not happy if you send them 1,000 pages. These times is over, right? I mean, that used to be the case, but they no longer, they say, do you really need so many footnotes? Can't you, make the bibliography smaller, and so on and so forth. So at some point I decided, rather than writing too little, to leave that subject out, and also Hong Kong. But I'm now working on a book on Hong Kong history. And if I ever make it, I would really love to write a history of Taiwan.
Oh, wow.
Because I think then that would allow me, again, it adds to the complexity, the uniqueness, but also the fascination of the Chinese world, if we see it in these different places. So that's my ambition and dream, but I don't know if I can, if I have to.
Please work with us, to make this come true.
Yeah.
I'm sure you can do it. I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm very sure you can do it. Yeah, and we just kind of have like 2 minutes left, And I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Mühlhahn again for giving us such a wonderful and a lot of information and a lot of very new ideas, for us to debate later. And I also like to express my gratitude to Professor Liang Qianhao, for inviting me, for having me have this chance, to co-host and to learn actually a lot of things, from Professor Mühlhahn. And thank you so much. Yeah.
And pleasure is ours.